All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Carbon Commitments and ESG Reporting, Turning Promise into Practice. My name is Twyla Neely-Strite, and I'm the Education and Operations Associate at Illinois Green Alliance. Today's program was put on by the Illinois Green Alliance Programs Committee, a volunteer group that coordinates education events covering a wide range of topics throughout the year for the green building industry. The team that put on today's event consists of Jill Farr, Chelsea Lamar, and Jennifer Alvarado. You have all been muted upon entry, so please type any questions you have into the Q&A and we'll get them answered at the end. This webinar is being recorded and will be sent out to you in a follow-up email. And for those who are unfamiliar, Illinois Green Alliance is a membership-driven nonprofit organization that advances green buildings and sustainable communities for all. Our 5-year strategic plan pushes the green building industry to meet or get on the path to net zero. We achieve this work through education events such as panels and building tours, by engaging communities and partnering with organizations across Illinois, and by advocating for new policies and legislation. Members can view our recorded webinars on our on-demand webinar library on our website. You can also learn more about membership, see upcoming events, and get involved by visiting our website, illinoisgreenalliance.org. I also just want to take a moment to recognize our sustaining sponsors who make our work possible. A special thank you to our gold level sponsors, ComEd, Resource Innovations, Sloan, and USGBC. Make a commitment to advancing green buildings in communities across the state. Start a conversation about sponsor partnership today at illinoisgreenalliance.org/sponsorship. We have a great lineup of speakers for today's program. Jessica Bollhoefer spent the last 20 years working at the intersection of sustainability, business, and real estate. She is currently leading global sustainability, carbon, and energy for real estate and workplace services at Google, including real estate, transportation, and food. Prior to Google, Jessica led her own sustainability consultancy, JPB Strategies, and co-led the sustainability consulting practice at Jones Lang LaSalle. Jessica has a master's degree in sustainability management from Columbia University and an undergraduate degree in architecture from the University of Pennsylvania. Lauren Winkler, Senior Director of ESG and Innovation at Green Cities Company, creates the overarching vision and direction of their ESG platform, seeking to ensure the Green Cities Company remains an industry leader in ESG. Through leadership and collaboration, she drives strategic ESG initiatives both in the Green Cities portfolio and in their firm. With 18 years of experience in the alternative investment management sector, Lauren brings an institutional perspective to their ESG program, promoting best practices and innovative approaches that serve their portfolio and investor stakeholders. As Director of Climate Impact on JLL's Global Sustainability Team, Emily Duff collaborates across the company's business lines and other key stakeholders to develop and execute its sustainability strategy, including its net zero target. Her previous experience was in the nonprofit sector, where she leveraged the influential voice of the business community and sustainability leadership by the private sector to accelerate state-level climate action. Our moderator, Kevin Augustine, is a Senior Vice President and ESG lead in the North American CMBS Global Structured Finance Group at DBRS Morningstar. DBRS Morningstar is a credit rating agency and investment research firm headquartered here in Chicago. In his role, Mr. Augustine covers several esoteric finance instruments and leads Morningstar's efforts to provide credit ratings for CPACE commercial property assessed clean energy loans on a national basis. He also serves on the firm's ESG methodology subcommittee and leads their other ESG initiatives. Before joining DBR Morningstar, Mr. Augustine's career has been focused on urban infill development in Chicago, leading teams responsible for the redevelopment of Piper's Alley and the North Pier, as well as development of River East Center and other large projects. He has over 25 years of real estate development and finance experience with several national real estate development firms and financial institutions, including Bank of Montreal, Trammell Crow Companies, Opus, and C3 Capital Partners. Now I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Augustine to introduce the topic of today's panel.
Thank you, and thanks to all of you for joining us today, and thanks to our panelists. So I thought I would just spend a few minutes putting this into context and laying out a little bit of our plan for this afternoon. So as you know, many firms, and maybe many of your own firms, have made commitments to reduce and ultimately eliminate carbon emissions from the operations of their companies. And this has taken the form typically of a staged approach where people have made commitments to maybe cut their emissions in half by 2030 and then fully eliminate emissions by, say, 2050. And as companies make those commitments and then begin to actually implement and think about how those commitments are going to be met, they pretty quickly realize that real estate plays a very important role in meeting those net zero carbon commitments. So the strategy is to take a look at a property portfolio and look at the real estate that a company uses, whether it's real estate that they own or real estate that they perhaps lease, and begin to think about strategies to decarbonize and lower carbon emissions. And so that's a large part of what we're going to talk about today, is how to look at both the property level and the portfolio level and look at how we can reduce that carbon and in turn help these companies meet their commitments. From our standpoint, from a rating agency, but really reflective, more broadly on this, we're certainly concerned about weather-related events that impact our properties, but we're also interested in making these buildings efficient and eliminating carbon, because if not, you run the risk that these properties will just not be useful to people. It's a term that we refer to as standard. I put up a real simple slide just to kind of frame this a little bit. So in the slide, you see what has been maybe a historical way that buildings have operated. Buildings have either burned fossil fuels on site, or they bought electricity, for example, from a power grid that may not have a very high concentration of clean energy sources. There's also the issue of embodied carbon, where there are certain ways to catalog the cost of mining, producing, transporting elements into a property. The way that we want to look at this a little more going forward is to say, what can we do first to certainly increase energy efficiency, therefore decreasing the need of energy that we need at a building, which will certainly help lower carbon emissions, but then to also look at how that energy is produced. So we're talking about things like electrification. We're talking about other strategies that we would use to reduce carbon and maybe even using alternative sources of energy that are produced on site. So all these get caught into the mix. And so the strategy is really to think about how a real estate portfolio can be modified, adjusted, tweaked to help companies meet these net zero carbon commitments. And so what we'd like to do this morning is start first with kind of square one and talk about, if you are looking to do this, what type of policies, programs, planning that your firm should do to begin to set the stage for the implementation of a net zero carbon program. Second, to really talk about some specific recommendations and strategies and things that our panelists have used in their own organization to do that. And then finally, once that happens, we want to be able to talk about reporting it and quantifying it and delivering it to people that we have as stakeholders that will want to be able to track and know about a company's net zero carbon progress. So let's jump in. We have a great panel, and we'll go through those three particular tracks. So first, let's start out with a question about, for each of the panelists, actually, I'd like each of them to respond. Why was setting a carbon commitment important for your organization's overall business strategy, and how did you go about defining net zero? Let's start with Jess. So give us some background on your work.
Hi, Kevin. Thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to be here. Really appreciate the opportunity. So speaking on behalf of Google a bit, but really trying to take the lens of being part of a real estate organization. So I take a look at the food, transportation, and real estate for our portfolio, and specifically look at our net zero strategy and how essentially we're getting from here to 2030. We have a 2030 reduction target. But I think that, in regard to why it's important to set that carbon commitment, I think for most organizations today, carbon commitments are really in alignment with social values. What was nice, once a nice to have, now is really business critical, and it's a license to operate, and Google is no exception there. But when we think about this actually from a real estate portfolio, how it really impacts us specifically is, I think first and foremost is a financial risk. So climate risk is a financial risk. It continues to be an evolving issue, but it's very clear that it poses really financial risk to businesses and investors. For Google, what that means from a real estate perspective is really about business continuity and also about the assets that we actually own. So business interruptions are incredibly expensive and continue to be a threat to our businesses overall. The second one is really about attracting and retaining top talent. So Google specifically, our businesses, our people are really a big part of our world and our brand. And so the offices that we operate in, we've got about 800 worldwide, are really an important place of how we actually show up to the communities that we operate in. And so employees are continuing to look for employers that are socially responsible and sustainable, and our employees really hold us accountable, and they really see sustainability in the offices that we operate in. And so it continues to be an incredibly important part of our business strategy. And the third one is really more about actually the business that we're in. So building trust with customers and partners. One of our big sort of focuses is building technology that helps people do more for the planet. And that's really a cornerstone of what Google does. And so we're doing a lot from customers and partners to make sure that we are taking climate change seriously, but also making sure that we are creating new opportunities for other businesses to continue to move forward from a sustainability perspective.
Great. Lauren?
Well, just for a little bit of background on the Green Cities company quickly, because we're in a lot different position than a Google might be. So we invest in multifamily assets throughout the United States from a value add strategy perspective. And when you think about what the impact of real estate is, just globally, I think if I'm at one more conference where I hear that the built environment is responsible for 40% of the world's emissions, we all know that this is true, but as a real estate investor, then, the Green Cities company says that we invest at sort of that point of confluence of environmental, social, and investment value. So when we think about net zero and the reason why we think it's important, besides the obvious imperative for the planet, is, one, from a cost perspective in terms of the operating the NOI of our buildings and how we think about income and expenses as they relate to the energy and water usage of our buildings. Two, the fact that we are an investment fund, so the demands of our institutional investors and what they're looking to see in terms of no longer just writing the value of the investment, but also making sure that when you exit a property, you're exiting a more resilient and efficient structure than when you came into it. And two, just the general marketplace. And there's a lot more statistics on this in the office space. I'm sure, Emily will have a lot to say about that, but, you can look at all sorts of mounting evidence in the marketplace that is really showing now not only a brown discount where those properties that are not efficient are achieving a lower valuation, but a green premium. And the more that we continue to have legislation, like, in New York, Local Law 97, Illinois has a lot of sort of pro-decarbonization legislation that's happened, the more that is a trend in the US, the more we think you're going to see a lot of exit value on the types of properties where net zero has really been taken into account. Emily, I set you up there.
Great, thanks. Emily?
Perfect. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. Just to give a little foundation on who JLL is. So for those who don't know, we're a commercial real estate services company. We're headquartered in Chicago, and we help our clients buy, sell, build, manage, and occupy, invest in different commercial real estate assets. So industrial, commercial, retail, hotels, the list kind of goes on. And in terms of our company, I mean, we've been on a 15-year journey, and we were actually one of the first companies to come out with an SBTI validated net zero target to get to net zero by 2040 with an interim target in 2030 of 51% reduction. So really, when you ask about the definition, we're just in line with SBTI and focus on kind of mitigation hierarchy, where we want to reduce our emissions, and we've committed as part of our target to reduce our use of offsets and only have 5% of our baseline allowed for offsets. And I think, Lauren and Jess talked about a lot of the factors and drivers of why we would set this type of commitment. I mean, beyond just what the science is telling us, those kind of physical climate risks, we know that. But also we wanted to kind of stake a leadership position in the real estate industry. The built environment, like you said, Lauren, 40% of emissions. It can be seen a bit of as a laggard when it comes to companies really setting strong targets. And both of you kind of spoke to the stakeholder expectations. I mean, when we're working with client RFPs, they're constantly asking us, what is JLL doing? What kind of targets have you set? Our shareholders are paying attention. They supported our commitment to net zero, employee recruitment and retention, and of course, regulators. I mean, globally and in the US, we're just seeing increased regulation and making sure that we're not just kind of falling behind the regulation, and we're really leading on this. I think the last thing I would say is we don't just see setting a climate commitment as a way to reduce and mitigate risk, but really as an opportunity, a revenue generator. We're a services-based company. We have a growing sustainability services arm where we're advising clients on how they can decarbonize. And so we need to actually kind of walk the walk and demonstrate that we're a leader. And so they can know that we can also support them because we're already doing it for ourselves.
That's really good. And Emily, just to continue, so once you go through the process where an organization has decided, okay, we recognize that this is important. I know that you've all mentioned this fact that employees view it as important, and we certainly had that happen at Morningstar. We had our annual meeting yesterday, and I think the number was 95% of the employees felt that issues around ESG and climate risk and decarbonization were important issues. So once you've made that decision to do this, to go along this path, maybe you could talk about some of the steps or maybe important things at the outset that you do. We'll talk a little bit about specific recommendations on programs and actual work, but what about the, kind of the setting up the initial steps and the initial targets and timelines?
Yeah, sure. Great question. So in terms of kind of getting started, I think every company's decarbonization journey begins with a comprehensive greenhouse gas footprint assessment, understanding where you are, where your boundaries are. That's a critical piece to be able to set a target across all three scopes. So scopes 1 and 2, relatively straightforward just because they're really about your corporate fleet, your purchased energy. So that's things like electricity, natural gas. But then scope 3 is really the value chain. So your supply chain, business travel, use of sold products, it's kind of everything up and downstream. And it's a tougher nut to crack in terms of assessing. But I think you kind of start with that. And then in terms of the other factors that you should be thinking about as you're setting a target, data is really critical. So doing data well and data management well, it just requires a lot of cross-organizational collaboration, stakeholder engagement, technology investments. And so just making sure that you are putting in place the right processes and systems to have good, accurate data. Hopefully that's automated. And that really just lays the foundation for creating a strategy, being able to assess different actions that you can be taking to decarbonize, It helps guide investment decisions. And then really also importantly, it helps you track your performance and making sure you have the feedback loops there to see how different actions are kind of actually impacting your footprint. And if I could just add one more piece around kind of the setting of the target, obviously you need your executive buy-in to say, we're going to do this. You got a footprint and agree to what your actual reductions will be. But you need to think about the implementation. It's not just about setting, it's about the delivery. And so what kind of enabling conditions can you start to get ready as you're thinking about setting the target? Because JLL did some research, and a lot of companies will set a target, but a small percentage actually have that detailed plan in place to execute on it. And it kind of used to be the days when corporate sustainability was on the sidelines, kind of doing their own thing. But net zero, really, you can't be siloed in this, and you need the right kind of governance and frameworks and accountability mechanisms to get it embedded in your organization to actually kind of achieve these targets.
Yeah, Jess or Lauren, anything to add? I know that I'm a real estate guy, right? So I think about it purely from a real estate perspective, but corporate travel, all other aspects, how you manage your supply chain, all those other things are so important, and it can be pretty overwhelming. We'll talk about implementation in a second here, but Lauren, Justin, anything else you want to add to that? Okay, we can move down now to implementation and talk about some of the nuts and bolts and some specific things that maybe we want to talk about. So Lauren, maybe we'll start with you and tell me a little bit about some of the programs that you've established and some of the strategies that you're implementing today. Give us a little window into if you're just starting one of these programs, where you might eventually want to get to, perhaps, and see. And give some guidance to somebody who's starting out and moving along the path.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the right question. And I didn't unmute when you just asked your last question, because I knew that there's no way to answer the question on implementation without really addressing some of the specifics, right? And really getting into, I think Emily set it up exactly right, which is I'm personally, as an ESG professional, a little bit afraid for 2030. Is there going to be like this, absolute wrath of companies that are coming out saying, oh, shoot, we didn't make our goal, because it's easy to set the goal and it's not as easy to really define a pathway of how you're going to get there, just like any business strategy. So we actually have a cute little acronym that Grand Cities came up with for how we think about it at the asset level, which really could be used for any holder of a piece of real estate, if you're an investor or a corporation. And that's decarb. The D being, you have to have a really defined climate action plan. And I'll talk about that in just a second. The E being that you need to constantly be evaluated and have the mechanisms and the metrics in there for that evaluation. So all that data that Emily was just talking about, it is absolutely the biggest nightmare of my existence, but it is the most important thing for both measuring and making quantitative the where you started and what the impact was and the progress that you're making. The C in decarb for us is it cost effective? We are stewards of capital. A business owner is always looking at their bottom line and where are their strategies that you can implement that are decarbonizing as well as contributing to your financial performance. A, asset specific. Not every building is going to be the same. What I'm able to achieve or think about as a value add investor in a multifamily building that is existing is much different than a developer that's ground up, is much different than an industrial owner. So really think about the property itself. Our R is it repeatable? Don't need to be reinventing the wheel every time. As much as you want to be specific to the asset, there are certain elements of the strategy that you can continue to do that should be part of a really well-developed plan. And then because we're cute and you needed the B, it's for bold. Don't be afraid to take the risk. Put CapEx behind it. So now that I've set that sort of, our high-level decarb acronym, what does that actually look like is the question that you're getting to. And for us, it's operational. and CapEx. This is where you're really focused on building performance. So the easy one is efficiencies. We all know we can go around, we can put in LED lighting, we can retrofit HVAC systems, we can think through building temperature set points, you can run energy audits, you can see about the age of your existing equipment, how well it's operating, are there leaks in temperature. All those are really operational. Sometimes it's a small CapEx. You can retrofit a toilet to be more energy efficient. A lot of people forget about water, and that's actually one of the biggest contributors to energy usage on a property. So if you can achieve efficiencies in your water through your irrigation, your landscaping, your plumbing, all of that are sort of operational changes, sometimes requiring capital, sometimes just requiring site management that you can make that are really about lowering the overall energy use and profile of the building. And then there's more of the sort of planning, the intentionality around design, thinking through like passive house design. Are there changes that you can make that affect the airflow? Elements of the building surface and the facade that can be designed, materials that you can use. And don't forget, materials is not just concrete. We can throw out all sorts of great stats about how evil concrete is. And there's lots of really cool prop tech now for different kinds of concrete that are carbon sequestering. But when we say materials, we mean construction materials, but we also mean FF&E, interiors, flooring, wallpapering, all of the kind of decor that goes into creating whatever the environment is. Could be a manufacturing site, could be an office building. You want to think through every piece of material, where it's coming through, how it's being used. And then lastly, I would say, take all of that then through to the end of its working life. How are you designing and setting operations and investing capital in the property today for continued decarbonization? How are you thinking about waste? If we're replacing elements, where is that going? If new construction needs to be happening, what are we doing with old materials? So I think you could have a 3-hour webinar just on the subject itself, but I think really getting very, very specific and thinking through all of the operations, design, material, and capital opportunities for your building are all ways you can get very specific about reaching those decarb goals. I'm going to add to that.
Yeah, great. Well, no, thank you. So Jess, I'm curious. So when I look at this, I initially start to think about this in terms of what happens at the building level. So, we can think about electrification. We can think about, changing the types of boilers that we use. We can look at lighting. We can talk about energy, production of energy. So all these things, right? But it's much broader, right? We talked about other things besides the pure real estate. But I guess the question I'm curious on is, you make some decisions about things that you would like to do, and maybe you start with a building or a subsets of buildings. But tell me a bit about, for a big organization like yours, how do you set this up to scale? How do you, roll it out in a big way and get sign on and make sure that it becomes more pervasive? What are some of those things that you use to, just bring it out to the broader portfolio and company level?
Yeah, it's such an important question. And I didn't unmute early enough, sorry, to follow up on the conversation with Emily. It was getting stuck. But I think that what's really fascinating is a couple of years ago, I actually had a lot of friends who were in the financial sector who previously had not been, sort of ESG wasn't really on their radar. And all of a sudden, everybody was talking about greenhouse gas emissions, except I recognized that everybody on the financial side was actually having a very different conversation than these people that I was working with on the real estate side. But we were all talking about the same things. We were still talking about greenhouse gases or carbon emissions, but one was talking about a building and one was talking about sort of this portfolio concept. And so what I've started thinking about for me personally is really the interconnection between those two. And so when I think about this from Google's perspective, or pretty much any organization, Google is just like any other big corporation right now. We're trying to set maybe more ambitious targets, and there are things that we are doing from our products that are unique. But from a real estate perspective, we have some owned, some leased portfolio, right? We have buildings that we're trying to operate. We have some food that we're trying to decarbonize. And so we're actually very similar to many other organizations. And so the first step is really someone sets an organization-wide sustainability goal. Okay, great, that happens. But at the same time, we have all these building sustainability goals that we've been focusing on. It started out with LEED, then there's WELL certification. There's all these sort of initiatives. We have Living Building Challenge buildings that we've been focusing on. We're looking at materiality and looking at lots of circularity in our systems. But how do you then tie all that incredible work that's happening on an individual basis to what can be actually scaled and looked at from a portfolio level? And really the way we think of it is both. You had to have both. So we actually set up our teams in order to be able to actually support both aspects. So just like we were talking about earlier and Lauren had mentioned, there's an incredible amount of work that can happen really from a bottom-up perspective. This is everything from site selection. So where are you locating your buildings, either globally or specifically within a region? It's making sure that you're thinking about end-of-life replacement. So opportunities for electrification as equipment is failing. Answering specific regulatory requirements. So local law 97, and we spend a lot of time talking about EU taxonomy in my world lately. New site-specific EV infrastructure, regional transportation systems, and my favorite, which is really piloting new technologies. All of that happens on a regional basis. And so we actually have teams in each region that are helping to support those pilots and making sure that we're sort of doing everything that we can on a specific basis, as well as all of our construction projects that continue to move forward very sustainably with lots of different initiatives in place. But at the same time, we have a team that's really focused on our portfolio-wide, like top-down focus. So that's a little bit more of our global programs. So efficiency, electrification of our buildings, food procurement, smart buildings, that's all happening at really like a PMO basis right now. We essentially are trying to look at what are the commonalities and how do we create sort of efficiencies of scale when we look at it from a top-down perspective, and then start to think about what it looks like to actually bring that forward and actually implement on a regional basis. So again, I think it's really about making sure that you don't sort of do one in lieu of the other. It's really about a combination of both, looking at what you can do from a bottom-up perspective and not sort of miss those incredible opportunities, because those are also ones that people see, and people who are in the buildings as well, and are great stories to tell, as well as making sure that we're still sort of in the background while you're doing your GHG emissions accounting and having lots of conversations with controllership teams. You're also thinking about how you sort of drive things from a top-down perspective.
Great, thanks. And so just kind of keeping along with that conversation, so you mentioned a few things that you're down the path on. I'm curious which of these you thought might have been the most maybe challenging or difficult. I'm on this Chicago climate panel that ULI is putting together, and I talked to some of the people who actually are on the ground implementing these electrification strategies and all these things, and it's mind-boggling, right? It's just there's just so much that needs to be done, and so many challenges and so many pieces. I'm curious, what you found as some of the big challenges.
So I will name the biggest. We don't own a lot of our buildings. So
yeah, we have the same situation with Morningstar. We don't own 1 square foot of building. It's all leased. So
that's really one of the biggest challenges, is that and there was a wonderful presentation that I saw at an IGA meeting recently where the president of BOMA announced that this is really one of the hardest times for decarbonization in the built environment as a result of some of the lower lease rates, some of the changes that I think the real estate industry is experiencing right now. And so, and also, high interest rates, all the things that are making it more expensive for real estate right now to operate, makes it harder to actually implement a lot of these decarbonization strategies. And so for us, a big part of our real estate portfolio from our business perspective is leased. And so it's much harder right now for us to be able to sort of influence some things that we maybe otherwise wouldn't. But I'll say the other thing is really, is truly, it's a cost. I mean, no matter what organization that we're talking about, I think there's no longer the payback that existed previously. It's instead sort of a reputational risk that we're fighting against. And so there isn't really a great way to put okay, what if we don't electrify? What is the reputational risk as a result of that? And so we instead have to look at every single thing that we can do across our entire portfolio and sort of stack rank it to try to help figure out how we get the best sort of dollar per ton reduction, but also potentially sort of reputational risk as well incorporated into it.
Yeah, the conversations we have with investors, a couple of things come out of those. One is that there's a certain, what you reference as reputation risk, image, perception, that they want to be in the right building that projects the right thing. On the flip side of that, it's very easy to see how buildings that don't respond the right way, the term that's been knocked around is stranded, that these assets become stranded because, as a practical matter, everybody is looking for ways to meet their net zero carbon commitment. And if you can't do that, then with that building is of limited use, right? So it's really a challenge. So let's think about this in the context now that we've kind of decided to do it. We've made some headway. We've implemented some programs, scaled them out to the portfolio level, and then we've got to tell people about it, right? So we have a lot of different responsibilities regarding reporting, whether it's government mandated, whether it's asked for by our shareholders. There's TCFD requirements, and now new combined requirements. Maybe you take on the obligation to do some self-reporting through an organization like GRESB, but ultimately you have to be able to tell the story. So Lauren, talk about your reporting and how does ESG reporting support the organization and net zero carbon commitment? How do you kind of get the word out?
Yeah, it's a great question and really essential. I've been told, by the way, that my audio is going in and out. So if it goes down, give me like a little signal or something and I'll lean in more. But I mean, Green Cities has really leaned in on reporting for, you nailed it, Kevin, for the reason that there's no better way to really demonstrate not only the commitment, but also the progress than either becoming signatory to or aligning with some of the standards of reporting that are out there. So, whether it's GRESB, whether you have an SBTI aligned target, whether you're doing your own sustainability or ESG reporting, we actually are a certified B Corp because we think about also our social impact standing, and that also has environmental considerations as part of it. We've been UN PRI signatories for the last 6 years. I mean, DEI code, TCFD, you could just go on and on with the alphabet soup of frameworks that are out there. I always say, and like Jess, I ran a consultancy before joining the Green Cities team and worked with over 4 dozen different investment organizations representing over 100 billion of assets under management, and they all had the same question, sort of which organization do I report to? And it doesn't matter so much the organization that you report to. It's more what are the lessons that we can take away from the questions that are being asked within those frameworks. So when we think about reporting and communication, it's not only just here's the number, it's also tenant engagement, right? Or communication to the marketplace. Why is this a goal that you've set? How are you setting it? Education around changing behaviors. Can you hear me all right? Yes. Okay. Sorry. Education around changing behaviors for people who are living or working and operating through the environment, of what they need to do to support your goals and what the impetus around that is. Emily mentioned data. That's also a really critical element of reporting. And I was a little bit joking earlier, but also crying when I talked about how difficult that is, but it's a really critical prompt that we get from some of the reporting standards and the demands of the marketplace. Again, it's not just data on, okay, these are our utility bills and now we understand what we're doing. It's, electricity, gas, water, waste, even looking at the demographics, the population, how people are interacting with your property and your on-site. Just brought up EVs. Are those being utilized? What's the penetration there relative to other parking? One of the questions that I'm sure we'll get to, talking about population density, if you're thinking through that both from a tenant experience, but also with your decarb lens on, and really taking a very holistic view to ESG, where decarbonization is one element out of many of creating a more resilient, effective, valuable property, all of it will benefit. So a small little example that I like to give of the Green Cities approach, just because it helps people understand, is we don't just look and say, this is a lobby that is really old and dated, we're going to retrofit it. We think through, right, if we're going to take out all those chairs, we're replacing them with what materials? Is there any off-gassing in those materials? And we're part of a group, Google's in it as well. We're really thinking through a common framework around collecting data behind chemical composition, but also environmental and carbon and greenhouse gas emission impact of all the materials used in all these pieces of furniture we put inside of our buildings. I talked about waste before. What are we doing with the old chairs? Are we bringing in different heights and different seating so that we can accommodate people of all different, shapes and sizes? When you take with every single decision that you make a very holistic view and think through it from that reporting lens, it's going to support not only decarb goals, but an overall more effective built environment, at that portfolio level.
Great, thanks. So Emily, I want to loop back to you, and there's a whole realm of reporting frameworks and processes and requirements that people could use. Maybe you could spend a little bit of time digging into a few of those that you think are particularly good or useful, or perhaps ones that do a particularly good job of showcasing an organization's progress.
Sure, and I know Lauren's kind of spot on with what she had shared in terms of kind of a daunting list of frameworks you can report to. JLL, we do CDP. I think that kind of across the board is used by...
So CDP for novices out there that don't understand the acronym?
Yeah, so it's actually formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project, but I think now formally goes as CDP.
CDP, okay, great.
Yeah. So I think that's a recent change. I think that's a great kind of framework to that a lot of companies use, and they actually use it on their supply chain too, to gather that type of information and be able to assess their suppliers. We also essentially we respond to a ton of them. We have people whose day jobs are responding to them, TCFD, the Corporate Sustainability Assessment, or CSA. And essentially what we've done is you have to see what makes sense for your business in terms of what are your competitors doing, what's the industry kind of best practice there, what are your kind of customers or clients looking for. And I would say that a lot of these frameworks are kind of ratcheting up or kind of raising the bar each year in terms of how you're being scored, in terms of if you've set a target, what level of ambition is the target, how are you engaging your suppliers, what policies do you have in place. And so I think they're really increasing the pressure on us to demonstrate that we're in line with best practice in the marketplace, because we know that regulation really just, it's slow to move forward. And so these frameworks are a way to kind of highlight your commitments and demonstrate your leadership as we kind of wait for different regulations, and especially on a global scale, to kind of catch up with where we're at in our decarbonization journeys.
Great. We have some questions from the audience that I want to get to in a bit, but before we do, I just wanted to kind of throw out a last question to the panel for each of you. So, put on your wise sage cap, and what would be a good kind of piece of advice that you would give to an asset manager or someone who's running one of these operations at one of the companies? Any particular, maybe a story, a pitfall, something that's really great Maybe there's a particular podcast or source of information that you find really great. Let's talk about that for a bit. Jess, you want to maybe go first?
Yeah, I love the idea of podcasts. I love podcasts, and they help me sort of think things in a different way all the time. But I'll say a few things of my experience, working both from a consulting side for clients and also now from an owner side. I think the first thing is start by really understanding your carbon footprint today. So emission inventorying can actually be a bit harder than you sometimes think, but it is incredibly important to have the best data that you can in order to actually really identify where the best opportunities are. The second one, and I'll make these quick, but is like call in the experts. There's a plethora of consulting companies out there that have a lot of experience in CDP, in science-based targets, in looking at carbon accounting, making sure you sort of have the right team on board, I think is really important as you think about tackling some of these targets. And I think the most important recommendation is making sure you get the right stakeholders on board. The higher up in the organization, the better. The more buy-in you have, the more successful your setting of a target will be. And it's not necessarily inexpensive to do carbon drive down sort of activities. And a lot of them really do require intensive capital. So if you can have finance on that stakeholder team, high recommendations there. Back to you, Kevin.
I have a finance question from the panel, which we'll get to in a bit. But Lauren, I want to chime in a little bit here on some things that would be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first, 100% agree with everything Jess just said. Very well said. I think, I would add, we touched on it a little bit, but also define what net zero actually means for your organization. There's a whole lot of confusing vocabulary out there, we're net zero or carbon neutral or climate positive, or, are you going by a certain framework or using the LEED zero framework? Are you looking at ILFI? I mean, it's really sort of mind-boggling when you start to get into it that net zero doesn't actually mean net zero for all different sorts of properties and organizations. So I'd say number one, get really specific about your definition, especially when you talk around scope 3 and that embodied carbon and what you're actually going to include in your net zero goal. And then secondly, I'd say that the faster and more directly that you can get operational with your focus, do it. It's too easy. And I've been in reporting and communications and consulting for so long. It's really easy to talk theoretical and to set goals and write statements that sound beautiful and forward-looking. It's not as easy to really get down and specifically say, okay, so for each element of this really defined, this is what net zero is to us. This is what we're going to do. This is the person who's in charge of it. This is the timeline for it. I mean, I think I said this at the top of the call. Just think about it like literally any other business strategy that you would look for. If you're looking to roll out a new product, it wouldn't only be about stating the business case for it. So get very specific and very operational quickly and put some capital behind it.
Great. Emily, you want to finish off?
Yeah, the only other things I would add, and I couldn't agree more around the buy-in piece too, is around kind of educating people to get that buy-in. I mean, for executives, there's varying levels of sustainability literacy, and I constantly need to be reminded that they don't know what these frameworks are. They aren't aware of carbon accounting and the methodologies that go into that. So it's a constant focus of ours to make sure that we're educating our employees internally and getting them on that journey. And then the only other thing I would add is don't wait, get started. I know I kind of harped on data, but it's an iterative process. You don't want to, it's never going to be perfect, and you don't want to wait till it's perfect because that won't happen. So I would say just start and get some action going.
Well, great, thanks. We have a few audience questions, which I'll go through and ask, and I couldn't help myself, but there is at least one question here that's somewhat finance related. So this actually came up at a panel I heard this morning, and it was more in the broader context of ESG investing. But have your groups, well, I'm sure you have, but give me some examples on how you maybe have calculated or thought about effectiveness, return on investment, any of these kind of metrics to kind of shore up, what you've been doing. I know obviously that there are municipal programs like New York Law 97, Local Law 97, that if you don't comply with, you could face a pretty big fine. That's a pretty obvious and pretty punitive kind of number, but in general, return on investment, what would this idea of making it fit into if somebody would ask you that, how would you do it? And any of you or all of you, I'd love to hear how you address that issue.
I don't know if anybody else wants to start. I mean, for us, we think about this a lot. It really does help for I'll say the work that we do, that there's a goal, there's a publicly stated 2030 goal, which means that there's automatically a business risk and a reputation risk if we don't meet those expectations. So I think that in itself provides the return on investment sort of answer. But I think generally it's sort of a combination of like cost savings when you can actually show that over time, even though a lot of things don't maybe not have like a 3 to 5 year payback, it's trying to sort of say, all right, let's look at it from a 10 or 15 year window. Increased revenue, certainly opportunities to actually, premiums or other things that have to do with whatever the business is. Certainly improve brand reputation. So that's one of the biggest things. That's of course something that we're thinking about quite a bit, making sure that this is not it's an opportunity to sort of bring yourself into a new sphere. And I know that I saw there was another comment about ESG, ESG generally and how it's being measured right now and some of the concerns and the backlash about ESG investing. But for right now, that continues to also be one of the benefits as a result of some of the ESG movement. But then, of course, it's risk. So whether risk of not meeting our 2030, risk of Local Law 97, those fines are significant. Risk of not meeting EU regulations, risks of fines or reputational concerns or losing customers or losing employees. I think risk is really something to make sure that we think about quite a bit and is probably the biggest, I think, ROI factor.
Yeah. Lauren, Emily, any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think I would just add, and maybe it's just an expansion of what I was saying a little bit earlier in the call. Everything that Jess said, but you also can have like a really direct ROI as well. I mean, efficiencies are probably the easiest way to think about that. And if I electrify the boiler, and I'm getting rid of not only decarbonization, but also, hopefully switching to a greener grid and a lower cost of electricity. There's a direct calculation that you can do on this is the piece of equipment and this is the return I'm getting and how many years over my whole period. But you can also look at the value that retrofit is adding to the building. And as a real estate investor, aligning that with your predictions as an organization on cap rates and exit values and what that's going to look like, it can often take what might on its face seem like an expensive capital expenditure, but when you sort of look at the ultimate value that it will provide to the building, divide that out over the number of tenants that you have, you realize that the annual value that you need to realize in the building as a result of doing whatever decarb strategy you just pursued, it's actually not that big. And is very achievable. So I think there's that kind of direct ROI and then the kind of longer term exit value that make often very compelling cases for decarb strategies.
Yeah. Emily, anything else? I just want to give you.
I think they mostly covered it. Yeah, I would
Great.
say that it's really kind of those things that are harder to quantify, like Jess was saying. And then, yes, the kind of energy consumption reduction, the actual in each individual asset, how you can kind of reduce and potentially save costs.
Yeah, and we'll make a lot of progress as time goes forward on how to incorporate all this. We incorporate this into our credit ratings process, but ultimately it's supposed to be a window into how the investment community looks at this as well. And so all of you brought up the issue of data and good data and how we integrate that data into the process and think through it. those are all really important, and ultimately that, the investment community is going to ask for some type of evidence that this is, making sense at some level. We had a question which I alluded to earlier, but is there a particular maybe podcast or information source or something that you kind of more consistently rely on as a little bit of a bellwether on how you might do your work? Any ideas? Anything come to mind? I could shamelessly plug the Illinois Green Alliance webinars and seminars, but I guess that's part of this. So
I responded to one of the people. I mean, for us as an investor, ULI Greenprint, and I think you mentioned that earlier, Kevin, has been just an absolute wonderful partner and a wealth of information. USGBC, Greenbelt, sort of all of the big conferences and alliances that are out there, as well as Illinois Green Alliance, are just great. Really, I guess the answer there is partnership within the industry, and wherever that you can connect with peers and competitors for their best practices. That honestly is the most inspirational. The podcasts I listen to are all about how I can get my teenagers to clean up their rooms and not necessarily decarbonization.
Yeah. I might also add a number of really great podcasts that are like specifically focused on decarbonization that are worth looking at. There are a couple through Bloomberg that are pretty good. Parts Per Billion is one of my favorites, and Zero is another one that's pretty good there. But there's a few ESG decoded ones. So I actually follow a number of just, sort of listening around to the different sort of podcasts that help. I think they really do help think about innovation quite a bit. And it's kind of fun to sort of think about a future. And that actually really does help with stakeholder engagement. So being able to sort of articulate what sort of fun things might look like in the future, I think is a really helpful thing to think about.
Yeah. Well, I think we're almost at time. This is really great, and it's such. I try to tell people when they think about career advice and what they want to do, and I tell them that it's always good at some point in your career, and maybe most of your career, to really be involved in what you would consider the issue of the day. And I think this is certainly it. I know from the real estate standpoint, the whole decarbonization effort is important on so many fronts. I mean, we want to do it globally because we see the effect of climate change on weather and how we need to spend more money to protect our buildings. So the real estate world's so focused on building performance, and then the other issue of transition risks, that you could be in a pretty bad position with an asset if you can't help your tenants meet their net zero carbon goals. So I really appreciate all of the panelists' time, and thanks to Illinois Green Alliance for putting this together. And we'll try to get some of the other answers in the chat answered in a follow-up email. I think most of these were around the definition of net zero carbon. I think we've covered some of that ultimately. So again, thanks. It's been a pleasure, and good luck. And any other questions, please reach out to any of us. Thanks.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Kevin.
Bye.